Hello and welcome back to Open School of Business. We took a break for summer and today I'm very excited to open up a new season for 2021 fall. And we will be equipping businesses who are starting up with a lot of new information, and we will be starting with finance and taxes. So today I'm very excited to introduce you to Ainel Forni, ACCA qualified tax and finance expert with over 15 years of international tax experience. You would be also fascinated to know that she's my sister, and she has been a major influence in my career and successes. And always when I have a business question or a challenge, I advise with her. And today, I am opening up that door to you guys so you can learn from the wealth of experience that my sister brings and from all the work that she's been doing across many industries. She started out with consulting and Big Four, then oil and gas, electronics, FMCG companies, and now she works in the University of Arts, London, and that's where Didara, one of our social media experts, also study. So I'm very happy to have two incredibly amazing women in my team who are from this great university. So without further ado, welcome, Ainel. I am very happy to have a conversation with you today and share your knowledge with our audience.
Thank you very much, Anar. Thank you very much for that introduction. Just to let everyone know that I started my career at Big Four at PwC, doing Kazakh Central Asian tax returns for different clients. And then when I got British Council scholarship to study in the UK, I moved to London, where I worked for PwC London, and they sent me to work for a client, British Gas at that time. Worked on a specific project on lobbying Kazakh government on different tax implications for oil and gas companies, which then led me to work in Kazakhstan on a specific contract, which was for 40 years. We negotiated a production sharing agreement with Kazakh government while I was with BG. That was absolutely fascinating, that experience where you see that tax landscape changes as well as company structures change all the time. Then I moved from BG to Shell, where I spent with them 6.5 years, where I worked not only in tax capacity, but also in finance roles like prepping budgets, looking at forecasts, and looking at the cost of the operations.
No, that's fascinating. I love the fact that you mentioned about how company structures can change the landscape of taxation. And that's something that is a privilege for a lot of big corporations, and not necessarily the small business owners know about these things. So if you were to advise business starting out, what kind of tax benefits they can leverage, or what kind of structures they can leverage in their business to take advantage of certain rules and taxation laws that are available?
I think you have to, first of all, look at the purpose of your corporation, whether you want to be as a sole trader, that's what we call it here in the UK, which is sole proprietorship in the US, and or you want to look at the partnership schemes where you partner with somebody, and therefore any income that taxable income you receive will be taxed at the partnership level, or you look at the limited companies, that's what we call it in the UK. This is limited liability companies in the States.
Yeah.
Where basically you're limiting the liability of the owners, and therefore that's most popular usually structure for new startups, where you are not liable for 100% if something goes wrong, or you can't, for example, repatriate any income from overseas. That's the structure we usually go for.
Right. And I think a lot of people do choose limited liability usually, depending on whether they want to get venture capital or not, because sometimes they do require a corporation kind of structure. But in general, I know that business owners love having the business in their name because they can also expense a lot of their expenses, like regular things like lease of a car, for example, or insurance and other things through their corporate account, and then they can get a discount and they leverage that way. So are there any specifics with the taxes as well?
Well, basically you pay tax on your taxable profits, so you will have your income turnover for any activities you do during the year, and then you'll have your deductions. Deductions, as you mentioned, those costs that are allowable for tax purposes. Not all costs are allowable, and therefore you have to look at your costs thoroughly, making sure that those costs are properly documented and they are for the business use. When it comes to, for example, your depreciation, you have to look whether tax rules are different from the accounting rules, where, for example, you can't take the full depreciation cost, you can only take specific tax allowances, specific capital allowances, where you just take the fraction of, let's say, depreciation costs. But mainly all costs should be deductible if they are basically born for business purposes. So there may be disallowance for, let's say, entertainment of staff or something, other costs which do not relate to the business activity.
I see. Yes. And I think, you know, today we're living in such a global world that a lot of businesses have clients all over the world without even knowing it. Like a podcast, for example, if I were to charge, it would become a taxation and finance nightmare, most likely, because I have audiences from all over the world. Like the majority is in the US, UK, and Kazakhstan, because I'm from there. However, I do get new countries almost every episode. And I was thinking, if you're in a business like this, and obviously I'm not charging right now, but if you were somehow to set up a Patreon webpage or sell certain merchandise products and send them and ship them over to all these countries, what kind of structure do you need, and what kind of tax advice do you have to seek for that?
Well, as you mentioned, because due to technology, we can now sell overseas much more easily. Our business is now becoming much global on a smaller scale, where you can directly interact with somebody, let's say, in Australia or China, and those your customers can pay for your services online, and that can be done technologically easy. However, what tax authorities realized that how they are losing lots of money, especially from big corporations where they are, for example, established in places like Luxembourg, and then they pay very low tax in comparison where if they will be paying it in the UK or let's say in France. So what they've done, they said, well, actually, we have to think more carefully about it, because now we see, though you are, for example, based in the States, or let's say you are based in the UK, but your customers are based, let's say, in China, or they're based in India, and therefore we think that you have to pay tax even though you are not established in that country. You have to pay specific digital tax, or you have to pay value added tax, and there is also goods and services tax, where you have to register for that and then comply with local rules. What it means that you have to engage somebody to register for VAT, for example, in United Arab Emirates.
What's a FAD?
Sorry?
You said you have to register for FAD?
VAT.
VAT, okay.
Value added tax. Where, for example, Middle Eastern countries, they don't have any threshold. So that it means that from day one, if you are selling to somebody who is not VAT registered in, let's say, United Arab Emirates, you would have to register in UAE for VAT.
I see. And I was very fascinated with the digital tax, what kind of tax it is and how do you register for that one?
I mean, for digital tax, I think at the moment thresholds are pretty high in Italy, France, and Hungary, for example. And what they are targeted for big corporations like Amazon, Netflix, Google. When it comes to small startups, medium startups, I think the risky areas you have to address is your VAT, basically. Where if you sell it, for example, if you are doing podcasts and they are fully automated, i.e. a user comes and just downloads it and listens to it, and then they pay you a subscription. Then depends on the country where that person is located. You would have to understand how much income are you receiving from that country. For example, if you have, I don't know, 75,000 Australian dollars in Australia customers, then it means you would have to register for their goods and services tax, because Australian tax authorities, they do not distinguish between automated or, let's say, live, let's say, training. For example, if you are doing training to some customers in Australia, whether it's recorded or live, I think they don't distinguish that. The same with Japan, where there's a consumption tax of 8%, I think, which increased recently, where, for example, even your usual English lessons that you, for example, provide to Japanese students, then there is this, again, certain threshold where you reach that threshold for turnover and you would have to register.
Okay, so I think that basically you have to check the countries you're operating in and see how much you're making there to make sure it doesn't exceed certain minimum amount at which you will have to pay for VAT and be also registered to pay VAT. I see.
VAT amounts may not be too high. For example, in Middle East, there's about 5% from, let's say, VATable amount. It's not a lot. However, tax compliance costs are very high. So you're looking at, for example, payment for registration for VAT, and you have to get someone local to do it, because you provide all the documentation in Arabic, and then all your invoicing have to be in Arabic. For example, if you provide services to Saudi Arabia, and somebody has to do it, and if you don't have that expertise, you will have to ask somebody locally to do it, and that is usually very expensive.
Right. And I think tech companies usually have an advantage of pre-programming it in advance to know the location of the user, how much they have to pay, and it can be seamlessly organized. However, you still need to do that background work of actually registering and getting somebody to do all that work in a specific country. So,
right.
and does it depend on the industry as well, like the thresholds and the amounts?
No, I think the main the main criteria is most countries, for example, in EU, they distinguish between whether your let's say a service is automatic, or let's say with minimum human intervention. So, for example, you download some music from somebody, or you download that podcast. If, for example, it occurs, then there is a need for VAT registration in the EU. However, in case, for example, you have a group of students and customers, and then you provide live webinar, and then those participants pay for that webinar, then most countries they do not tax that.
I see, because it's just no knowledge transfer with the actual person.
Yes.
And doing. Is there sales tax, or that's what is similar to value-added tax in
Yes.
Europe?
In the States, there is based on, again, thresholds. In each state, they have that nexus where, let's say, you reached 100,000 of income from the specific state, and or you have reached 200 transactions in that state. That's where you would have to register again for sales tax, and that's gonna be quite complex for if you need to look at all your customers and see where they are with their IP addresses and their actual addresses. Because, for example, you may ask to provide their let's say address. They may be based let's say in New York, but they then go and download that webcast somewhere in California. That kind of thing, you have to be aware, where you would need to know where that customer actually is when enjoying that service.
So basically, wherever the IP address would be the most correct, then. Right.
That's where I think technology kicks in. When you have that support, technological support, then you would know where your customers are. Of course, you can't register in every country in the world, so you have to look at your tax risks and see where the highest income you're getting, where the tax penalties and the fines are much higher than let's say other countries. For example, in Middle East, and they are very high, even though the tax may be very small. But if, for example, they find out that you are selling it to Middle Eastern, let's say, customers, the fines and penalties are quite high.
All right. And maybe it will also depend on which countries are more likely to enforce and do audits and things like that? Like in your experience, how does the discovery usually happen?
I think it usually happens when tax authorities, they audit some platforms which sell services, and then they check whether those platforms pay that VAT, or the seller which is on that platform pays that tax.
So that's another tip in terms of the best practices. I think check the platform where you distribute the information, and if the platform is compliant, that means they're already doing the work for you, most likely, right?
You have to review the contract between the platform and yourselves, and then the responsible for this specific, let's say, indirect taxes, whether you're just selling that product and then they take care of all that taxes, relevant taxes for you, or they say, actually, we will be taking care of, let's say, maybe only indirect taxes like VAT, but taxes like withholding tax at source may be your responsibility. It's basically a corporate income tax in countries, for example, where technical services are considered as subject to a tax at source. For example, you provide technical services from the US somewhere, let's say in Africa, let's say Nigeria, and well, they say, well, because the income is coming from Nigeria and this is technical services, if there is a tax treaty between UK and Nigeria, great, and then the tax rate would be lower, let's say, and you'll be paying, I don't know, 8 to 10% tax, which usually, what usually happens, that the company who's receiving your services, they pay that tax for you. And what they do, they pay you less that tax, which you may not be aware of, and therefore you have to put into your costing model, for example, this tax will be deducted, and therefore this is the cost for me. When, for example, you are developing a product, you should factor in all the tax and tax compliance costs into the model so that you are not losing any money.
All right, yes. And also not to forget that in the US, we always pay the US taxes no matter what other business you're doing in other countries and what else do you pay to them. So while we were talking, I just thought of 3 examples of where you could use a platform to sell your things, and it could be creative services, or it could be even just regular products, retail products, like Instagram has a shop. Then Coursera, if you're doing it's become very popular recently, having your own course and selling it on Coursera, Udemy, and other kind of sites. So that's where it's a platform and it's there. And also Spotify, music and podcast and any kind of creative content. And most of the time, these platforms, they provide you with support. Can you say that there's needs to be maybe another layer of precautions you should take? Like you said, read the contract between your platform and yourself to see who is responsible for the tax. Are there any other things that you need to be aware of when looking for a platform, choosing a platform? For example, Shopify is also a very popular one where you can set up a site to sell anything pretty much.
I think that's mainly you have to review the contract who is responsible for indirect taxes. Usually platforms do look after that because it's easier for them to do that rather than for each individual seller. But there are platforms, you have to look at their reputation, and sometimes you'll see that there is some tax evasion happening because of your, let's say, platform is not doing what they're supposed to do.
Right. And with the growth of all digital, there is another one, big one is in-app purchases, where the app itself is free, but then you purchase certain things inside of a phone, like a game, you can get points and other things, superpowers and stuff like that. And that's also a global market. And the big companies, I'm sure they took care of that because they have big teams of people working on it. But if you're just a startup programmers, like just putting something together and putting it out there, what is the likelihood of being audited or being needing to be registered for VAT, for example? Is that even considered a VAT? How do you say that? Is that even subject to VAT, I would say, like games and little apps to help with things on your phone?
Well, I think it depends on a number of factors. First of all, how, let's say, tax authorities in that country are up to date with the technology, and also whether your brand and your marketing has been in that country very, very seen by by normal public, and then that would create that and a sort of curiosity from the authorities saying, well, this company is doing well and they're doing it in our country, and they let's check it out. And that is really easy for the tax authorities nowadays. Obviously, it's much easier to track when you sell goods because they go to the customs. That's where there is a physical check whether that, for example, anything you are selling subject to customs and VAT. When it comes to services, it's much more difficult. But if, for example, your company's profile is seen and is seen like you're doing business in that particular country and you are successful, then obviously there will be interest from the authorities.
Right. I mean, I think it's every entrepreneur's dream to be actually seen by the authorities, because then they can solve it, because that means they're successful and people are downloading and it's popular. So it is actually great. Another questions I wanted to get into is the versatility of your background, and how you can now even see like what industries and what products are easier to manage in terms of tax, and how you went from one industry to another successfully, being focused on taxes. I'm wondering what are your techniques on learning the new industry? How do you switch? And currently at the university, how different is that work from what you've been doing so far?
Well, I think it's a constant learning curve, well, industry-wise, as well as the tax landscape is changing rapidly on year to year basis. So you have to be updated basically constantly on what's happening around the world, which country is implementing which tax. And especially due to COVID, and there are lots of exemptions, and there are lots of changes when it comes to, let's say, home working or digital learning, and therefore this is something you have to be sort of on the ball. Industry-wise, I think tax principles are the same. So I think I read in one of the Japanese tax authorities websites saying tax is actually your membership fee to the society, which means at the end of the day, if you are receiving income from particular source, you would pay tax in that country, for example, Japan, and you have to just put that into the context, and therefore, for example, of course, you can structure so that you pay minimum tax in that country. Let's say you look at your thresholds, you make sure that your, let's say, webcasts are not automated, but then it means your business is kind of following the tax rather than business tax should be following business. So if, for example, your business objective is to have this automatic downloadable webinars, which anyone can download and listen to, and they don't have to be on a specific live, let's say, webinar, then which means you have to look at the fact that you have to register in that country. And if your income is going up, where your tax risks are. So that's something to keep in mind.
Yes, I love the concept of risks, because there is no risk-free business as there is no risk-free life either. So it's all about just measuring what is sensible and then doing it step by step. You know, focus on the business and then see where the most risk and actually cover that, or even decide that, okay, this will be the risk I'm willing to take. Maybe potentially because you're growing very slow in that particular country and it's not really reaching the threshold yet, which is, you know, you should focus on the ones that you are actually already reached the threshold, and you need to start paying the taxes there.
So I think it's to have a sort of good financial model helps. For example, you have all your costs added, so that you know whether it's really profitable doing something in this particular country, whether, for example, do you really want to trade in that particular country? For example, it could be lots of admin work, it could be translation, notary services, legal services, which you haven't taken into account, and therefore you may be losing money because these costs were hidden costs from you, which you were not aware of at that time. And doing this specific sort of country analysis really helps.
Right, yes. And I know that you started your career in Kazakhstan and you devoted a lot of years to learn the taxation there. And when you moved to UK, you already had experience with all the UK companies who went to do work in Kazakhstan. So when you were transitioning from that oil and gas structure to a different industry in the UK, What were the things that helped you to learn quicker? And also, did that network that you build up in your early career help at all in your next chapter of your career?
I think it's important to understand that the tax principles are the same, the rules are different.
Mhm.
I mean, they could be vast legislation, let's say, which is in the UK, where you would have to read chapter by chapter how this item has to be treated for tax purposes, for example. And in some countries, it's very straightforward. However, because it is straight, let's say it's very full of ambiguity, it's subject to interpretation, and therefore it's kind of thinking of common sense. How would you interpret this piece of law? Basically, to say, well, can you justify that, for example, you are deducting this particular cost because it doesn't say in the legislation what to do with it. Therefore, then again, it can be only argued in the courts whether you are right or you are wrong, but you have to make those assumptions when you, for example, doing your tax return. Either in the US, obviously, there's a lot of specific legislations which tells you what to do, but in some developing countries, that's lacking, and therefore you would usually go for advice, sort of tax specialist advice, who will tell you, based on our experience, let's say, the tax authorities never argued that this cost should be taken into account. I think that's
Yeah. So from the point of view of our audience, if I'm just starting out and I'm looking for an accountant and I'm looking for a tax specialist who's going to help me with my taxes yearly, what criteria do you think I should use to hire that person? What kind of questions I should ask to make sure that's the person that I'm going to be comfortable working with, and they're going to take my best interest at heart?
well, I think it is tricky. For example, when if you are thinking to trade globally, there are not many international tax experts. They're very country-specific experts, which you can rely on. And what happens, you may have initial advice from your accountant, but if that accountant doesn't have any experience on cross-border transactions, you only have this local expertise, let's say, what you have to do in the US, what tax filing requirements you have, which you need to do as a, let's say, US based company. But if you are sort of moving overseas and trading cross borders, then I mean, obviously it's good to contact, let's say, big fours like PwCs and Deloitte's. However, they are very expensive, and most
Yeah.
other companies cannot afford their fees. So what happens then? People rely on sort of medium tier consultancy companies, which will have, let's say, sort of knowledge hubs in different country. So and you also need to take into account any local providers, which can be cost efficient. However, you may have difficulty with, let's say, language, or you may have difficulty of understanding what they actually mean when they advise you. And therefore, I think having a chat to, let's say, all these three providers, and then looking at the cost of that service, you would be better off maybe something mixed. For example, all your tax compliance costs tax compliance services are done locally by local providers, and then let's say initial advice being sought by that let's say international tax experts.
Right. And that's why I think this route and the path you took as your career is so unique, and it has a lot of success for that specific reason. There are not many people in the world who can advise on most of the things that you know now. And it's just great that you've been reading up and being all up to date with all the new developments in the tax area, and being able to use what you learned in one industry and apply it in a different industry. So that's been, I know that you've been a highly competitive person from the beginning, like in your career at the school and university, and winning the prestigious scholarships to actually pay for your education and get you started. I'm curious, what was your driving force? Like, how did you motivate yourself back in the day, and how do you still motivate yourself nowadays?
I think it's important that you should like what you're doing. For example, at the beginning, maybe it's difficult to find your path, and therefore what you strive to be the best and the first, and that's what usually what you get satisfaction from. For example, winning a prize, go into a competition and making sure that you win it. You do not shy from, let's say, any difficulties or obstacles. Even though they come your way, you have to try again. I think that sounds a bit cliche. However, it does work, and it does help, because perseverance and sort of having an objective, say I want to study and work abroad, then it means what you have to do, you have to ensure that you can communicate in that language where you're going. You have something additional to be to shine from the crowd, and therefore you have to something extra, let's say either your technical knowledge, your maybe your social skills. That helps a lot when it comes to being like part of the team. Do you really like to work with that person? And that is also important. That's how people usually choose a member of the team, see how likable you are. And I think now I'm really passionate about what is happening on the tax arena, what tax authorities are planning to implement. There is a major project in EU called base erosion and profit shifting, that what we would discuss today, where, for example, tax will be paid not where that company is located, but where the customers are. So this basically that profit is shifting to another country where traditional tax system didn't handle before, because there was no need, because we had an office, let's say, in London, and we provided services to UK customers. Nowadays, because of technology, you can trade anywhere.
Right. And I think people, I would say countries, they want to make sure that if they're spending the money, their citizens are spending the money, and therefore they can benefit from that directly. Their communities can get better directly as a result of that. And thank you for sharing about how it is very important to not give up and try again. And really do everything that is required to get to that goal that you foresee for yourself. And I can see that you're very excited for the future of the tax arena, because this is something that you will be able to advise many companies who will be your clients in the future, because there are not many experts who are looking at this and analyzing it from the perspective of what's coming. And that's being extra step further, and therefore having an extra advantage that can help you grow your career and business in the future. Also, since we're talking about the future, I just want to ask you one last question about what is most exciting for you in the future and in your career, and what kind of hopes and dreams do you have?
I think future is exciting because I think mainly due pandemic now universities realize they can actually provide and teach online and not only to students in the campuses but also students overseas worldwide. Which means universities have this edge now to be able to provide this, and thus again looking at their tax exposure. And this is something I think most of the education sector and also there are other sectors in industries realize that this is the way forward, and which means that there will be lots of tax compliance registrations around the world, and therefore hopefully that will ensure that correct taxes are paid in correct countries.
All right, that is really exciting. And I agree with you, a lot of things gone online. And with me starting the Teen School of Business here in the US, I do still have people who want to sign up from Kazakhstan, some from Europe. So this is exciting in a sense of that the businesses, small and big, everyone, they are sort of having this playing field now where if you're really working hard, you can grow more. And, once you reach that threshold, start paying your taxes and everything will be great. So thank you so much for your very detailed, very insightful advice and sort of a taxation landscape description, I would say, because we don't give any financial advice that's not authorized by Open School of Business, especially in terms of taxes. Doesn't matter where you are. It's just a disclaimer. But thank you so much. I've been wanting to do this interview for a while because I wanted to share my great sister with the world and just really get to know you more professionally, because usually we don't get to talk about these things that often. So I'm really glad for that. And I wish you all the best of luck, and especially for the University of Arts London to grow and to get more students and really spread the creative content everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. I hope that's been useful. I'm quite happy to help out for any specific advice because I realize that so many startups are struggling and may not even aware of any sort of obstacles coming their way.